the line between faith and fanaticism, love and obsession, and life and death. It's a descent into the world of apocalyptic visions, secret pacts, and chilling disappearances. A world where those closest to you could suddenly be branded as something less than human, and where that judgment carried a deadly cost. We're pulling back the veil on the case that shook a community, that gripped a nation, and revealed just how dark belief can become when it turns into something else entirely. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded. Today, we are talking about an absolutely crazy case that I had not heard about, and it didn't happen long ago, but it is highly disturbing. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through the windshield into these doomsday cult murders together. Chad Guy Daybell was born in Provo, Utah, and raised in the nearby city of Springville. He grew up in a Mormon family and served a 2-year mission in New Jersey in his youth. And after high school, he attended Brigham Young University, or BYU, where he studied journalism. And while at BYU, Chad married Tammy Douglas on March 9th, 1990. And the couple eventually had 5 children and settled into an ordinary family life. Now, in the early 1990s, Chad worked as a sexton, which is essentially a grave digger for a church, at a cemetery in Springville to help pay for college. And he later said he had 2 near-death experiences as a young man, which profoundly influenced him. And those experiences, according to Chad, heightened his spiritual beliefs and gave him supposed insight into the afterlife. Themes that would feature in his later writings, as we will see. So after graduating from BYU with a BA in journalism, Chad took a job as a copy editor for a local newspaper in Ogden, Utah. And colleagues from that time recall him as quiet and unremarkable. Ouch. Because he did not openly discuss any unusual spiritual experiences then, but Chad's real ambitions lay in writing. So in 2001, he published his first book, One Foot in the Grave, a collection of bizarre stories from his grave digging days. And finding modest success in the niche market of Latter-day Saint, or LDS fiction, Chad and Tammy started a small publishing company called Spring Creek Book Company to self-publish his novels. And he wrote doomsday-themed religious novels, including a series about the end of the world, blending LDS theology with apocalyptic scenarios. What is this sounding like? Say it with me. Cult, cult, cult. And by the mid-2010s, Chad had also begun publishing books by other aspiring LDS authors, notably near-death experience accounts. And in 2014, he published author Julie Rowe's visionary experiences, and around that time confided that the events in his own novels were based on visions he claimed to have had. So Chad's growing fixation on end times prophecies coincided with a major life change. And in 2015, claiming he received a personal revelation, he uprooted his entire family from Utah and moved to Salem, Idaho. And Tammy got a job as an assistant librarian there, and they relocated their publishing business as well. And friends would later note that Chad's personality had grown increasingly weird and obsessed with apocalyptic ideas around this time. Say it with me. Cult, cult, cult. It's just screaming. Future cult leader, isn't it? But still, those who knew him say there were few obvious red flags. And former neighbors and friends mostly saw him as a religious but soft-spoken family man and author. And no one could have predicted that within a few years, Chad Daybell would be at the center of a string of suspicious deaths and murders. So Lori Noreen Vallow Daybell was born on June 26, 1973 in Loma Linda, California, formerly known with the last name Cox. And she was also raised in a Mormon family, but her upbringing was unusual because her parents were anti-tax protesters aligned with sovereign citizen ideology, often clashing with the IRS. And as a young woman, Lori was very attractive, outgoing, and for a time worked as a hairstylist. And she also dabbled in the spotlight, because in 2004 she competed in the Mrs. Texas beauty pageant and even appeared on the game show Wheel of Fortune. I used to love that game show. But Lori's personal life was turbulent. She would marry young at 19 to her high school boyfriend in 1992, but that first marriage ended in a quick divorce. Her second marriage came a few years later in October 1995, when she wed a man named William LaJoya, and they had a son, Colby, born in 1996. So by 1998, that marriage too had failed. Not a great track record. And in 2001, Lori married for a third time to Joseph Anthony Ryan Jr., who became a stepfather to Colby and gave the boy his last name. So Lori and Joseph had a daughter together named Tylee Ryan, born in 2002. And this third marriage was highly bitter for the two of them, and they would divorce in 2005 amid a resentful custody battle during which Lori accused Joseph of abusing Colby and Tylee. And in 2007, Lori's brother, Alexander, or Alex Cox, actually attacked Joseph, claiming he had been abusive to Lori and the kids. Now, Alex Cox served 90 days in jail for that assault, and years later, Colby would confirm that he had indeed been molested as a child, though the claim had not been fully proven. And tragically, Joseph died from arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease in 2018. And police briefly re-examined Joseph's 2018 death for foul play, but found nothing suspicious and closed the case. And Lori's fourth marriage would tie her to the Vallow family, as we know her today. And in February 2006, she married Charles Vallow, a businessman from Arizona. And Charles was a devout Catholic who converted to Lori's LDS faith after their wedding. And together they raised Lori's two children, Colby and Tylee. And in 2013, the couple lovingly adopted Charles' grandnephew, Joshua Jackson, or JJ Vallow, who was then a baby. So JJ was the biological grandson of Charles' sister, Kay Woodcock, and Kay's husband, Larry. Now, the Woodcocks had cared for JJ as an infant, and the baby was unfortunately born drug exposed due to his biological parents' substance abuse. And this was before the Vallows adopted him, of course. So JJ had special needs and required a constant, loving routine, and he would be later diagnosed with autism. But by all accounts, Charles and Lori provided a very stable home for little JJ, and Lori was a loving mother to both Tylee and JJ in those early years. So the family lived in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, and even spent a few idyllic years in Kauai, Hawaii, running a small business before returning back to Arizona around 2017. But beneath the appearance of normalcy, however, Lori's priorities were shifting dramatically by the late 2010s, and she became increasingly obsessed with doomsday prophecies and extremist religious teachings. And friends and family later noted that Lori's personality started to change, and she began insisting she had a divine purpose and that darkness surrounded those who opposed her. And these growing radical beliefs, combined with Chad Daybell's influence, once the two eventually met, would set Lori on a dark path that few could have imagined. So Lori Vallow first crossed paths with Chad Daybell in October of 2018 at a religious conference in St. George, Utah. And the event was part of a preparedness and prophecy-focused series called Preparing a People, and it attracted LDS church members interested in end times teachings. And Chad was one of the speakers at this conference, presenting his apocalyptic theories and promoting his novels about the end of the world and all of his, afterlife prophecies that he's been having. And Lori would attend with a close friend, Melanie Gibb, and another associate, Zulema Pastenis. And Lori, at this point, had already been reading Chad's fiction and was a fan of his Doomsday podcast appearances. And when she heard him speak in person, she was immediately drawn in by his charisma and unconventional prophetic claims. And according to later testimony, when Lori and Chad were introduced at the conference, it was as if a spark ignited. A just giant shitstorm of a spark that would start a damn forest fire. So they would spend the weekend talking intensely about spiritual visions and their belief that they had met before in previous lifetimes. And flattered and intrigued, Lori absorbed Chad's every word, just gobbled it up. Despite the fact that both of them were married to other people at the time, Lori to Charles Vallow and Chad to Tammy Daybell, they formed an instant secret connection. And it's reported that during their very first conversation, Chad declared Lori was an eternal being of great significance. I've been told my eyes look pretty, but not that. That might get me. Just kidding. No, it wouldn't. These people are literally insane. But this kind of flattery and grand destiny just immediately appealed to Lori, who already had a few screws loose, if you know what I mean, and who already begun to view herself as someone with a special role in the end times. So in the weeks and months following that initial meeting, Lori and Chad's relationship escalated quickly and in alarming secrecy, and they began corresponding regularly. So it started as discussions about scripture, and Chad's unusual beliefs soon turned into open affection. And by late 2018, Chad and Lori did their best to see each other despite living in different states and still being married to other people, and Chad being in Idaho and Lori being in Arizona. But Chad would visit Arizona to see Lori under various pretenses, and Lori made trips north to Idaho as well. And it was during this period that Chad, who fancied himself a prophet, claimed he had received revelations about Lori. Very convenient, Chad. And he told her that she was an exalted godlike being appointed to carry out a special mission in the coming apocalypse, and that he, Chad, had been her husband in multiple past lives. Ah, man, it goes like so far beyond narcissism to think this of yourself, to just like come up with this and try to convince somebody else of this. And then you just got to meet somebody equally as narcissistic as you, and probably just not well. But it's bonkers to me. Anyway, according to Lori's close friend, Melanie Gibb, Chad and Lori firmly believed they had been eternally bonded and sealed by God, transcending their current marriages. How convenient for them. I don't think you can put that on divorce papers for a cause, but all right. So their affair intensified as Chad's prophecy grew more fantastical. And he convinced Lori that they had a grand destiny together to lead their righteous after society's imminent collapse. And they communicated in code and sometimes used burner phones to hide their frequent contact. And Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, discovered the affair in early 2019 and confronted Lori about it, but she dismissed his concerns. Again, how convenient for her, just being like, nah, it's crazy. That's crazy. I'm just an all-knowing being who's been eternally connected to this random man from Idaho. I don't know. Or Arizona. I don't know. And in fact, Charles grew so alarmed by Lori's radical talk and infidelity that he filed for divorce in February of 2019, actually citing that Lori believed she was a god preparing for Christ's second coming and had threatened to kill him if he stood in her way. I wonder what section you gotta put that under. I'd like to see that paperwork. But Lori managed to delay the divorce by persuading Charles to reconcile shortly after. But the damage was done, and she was fully emotionally invested in Chad Daybell by then. And as their secret romance grew, Chad bolstered Lori's devotion by weaving an elaborate elaborate spiritual narrative around it. And he told Lori that she had been a celestial goddess in previous eras and that he had been her divine consort. And at one point, Chad claimed Lori was once married to the ancient biblical figure James the Less, who he also claimed to be in that past life. And that Lori herself had been various historical figures of great spiritual significance, including and not limited to the wife of the angel Moroni, a key figure in LDS scripture. And he also said he was able to see their past lives together and that heavenly beings had brought them for a higher purpose. Just blah, blah, blah. Just so much bullshit. It's just crazy. It's crazy, but they're living in their little fantasy world, and that would be fine if they weren't evil, which they are. And for Lori, who had long been devout but never particularly famous or powerful, these claims were intoxicating because, narcissist. And she embraced the role Chad gave her wholeheartedly. And by mid-2019, Lori and Chad were deeply entangled, emotionally, spiritually, and even conspiratorially, because both still had spouses at home, yet they were making plans for their future together. And they even discussed that certain people close to them might need to die because evil spirits were inhabiting them and blocking their mission. Evil! And this is basically just a terrifying foreshadowing of what was to come. So in short, what began as an affair rooted in fringe religious obsession quickly evolved into a dangerous pact. And Chad and Lori's love story would soon leave a trail of broken lives and deaths in its wake. While researching these very heavy stories and after researching them, I usually need something to ground myself or something to kind of fidget with while I'm doing it, because I have pretty bad anxiety. But something that's really simple and keeps my hands busy while I'm processing everything is actually Fume Zero. Thank you to Fume Zero for sponsoring and supporting this channel. But Fume Zero, for those of you who don't know, is the brand new grab-and-go flavor, and you buy a checkable 99cm.com to start with zero, because sometimes the best evidence of change is the habit you leave behind. So start with zero and stick with Fume. So Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow didn't form a formal church, if you will, but they crafted a personalized belief system so extreme that it essentially functioned like a cult within their circle. And their doctrine was a distorted offshoot of mainstream LDS or Mormon teachings blended with New Age mysticism and apocalyptic fanaticism. Say it with me. Cult, cult, cult. And central to Chad and Lori's theology was the looming end of the world. What do we know about every single cult we've ever gone over is that there's always an end of the world prophecy, because that's convenient for the narrative, because you got to be afraid of something that's coming. So you got to believe in what these people are saying. Otherwise you're going to die in the doomsday or whatever. It dominates. It keeps happening. How does this keep happening? There's so many videos about it. Just know if somebody comes at you and they're like, hey, by the way, you got to believe in me because the aliens are coming back and I'm Jesus 2.0 and this is going to happen. And you got to give me $10,000 and leave your whole family. It's a cult. Anyway, Chad often prophesized that the final apocalypse was imminent. And at one point, he pinpointed July 22nd, 2020 as the date the world would end. The significant date every single cult leader does. It's always a date. But he claimed to have special prophetic gifts, including visions of future destruction and the ability to discern people's spiritual identities. And Chad told followers, and Lori fervently believed, that he had lived 31 past lives on various Earth-like planets. And Lori had lived 21 past lives, 5 of those with Chad as her spouse. And this idea of reincarnation, or multiple mortal probations, is far outside Orthodox Mormon doctrine. But Chad insisted it was true and necessary for achieving exaltation, which is external glory. And one of the most disturbing aspects of their belief system was a cosmology of light versus dark spirits. And Chad taught that every person was either inhibited by a light spirit aligned with Jesus Christ, or a dark spirit aligned with Satan. And he even devised a numeric rating system to score an individual's spiritual lightness or darkness on a scale. and with those deeply dark, considered to be under demonic influence. And according to Chad, if someone was taken over by a particularly evil entity, their true spirit was forced out and their body was then inhabited by a demon. So essentially rendering them a zombie in Chad and Lori's terminology. And they taught that these zombies looked like normal people but were no longer truly alive. And the possessing dark spirit would need to be driven out or destroyed. And frighteningly, Chad and Lori concluded that the only sure way to eradicate a zombie was to kill the host body, thereby releasing the person's original spirit from limbo and killing the evil spirit as well. So this lethal doctrine effectively turns certain people in their lives into targets for elimination under a twisted religious justification. And Chad also claimed to receive continuous revelations through a veil to the spiritual world. And he told followers he could open portals to other realms and communicate with angels and even deceased beings to get instructions. How convenient for Chad. Also, what cult leader's name is Chad? If I ever follow a Chad, hit me over the head, all right? And Lori soon declared she, too, had a direct line to God. And she believed she was a prophesied exalted goddess sent to lead the righteous in the end times, and that as such, she was not subject to earthly consequences. Quote, she couldn't be held responsible for her actions on earth, unquote. One friend reported Lori believed. Isn't that convenient? Wouldn't it be nice to just steal from your local Walmart, get caught and be like, I'm not an earthly being. I'm a goddess from another planet and I've lived 31 lives. None of these rules apply to me. And they're just like, oh, got it. Got it. Enjoy the sunglasses and sweater. That's fine. Who are these people? But they both talked about certain faithful people being translated beings, essentially having transcended to a higher spiritual level that gave them powers like not needing to eat or the ability to teleport at will. Needless to say, these ideas are not taught by any official LDS doctrine. Rather, Chad and Lori just cherry-picked religious concepts and rewrote them to the extreme, as one religious scholar observed. So to outsiders, the Daybell Vallow belief system sounded like wild fiction, like it does to you and I hope. But within their echo chamber, Chad in particular was very persuasive, like we see with a lot of cults. But when you're in that, when you're like feeling as low, you have like nothing to your name, you're not close with family, you don't have anyone, and somebody's just lifting you up saying you're like an extraterrestrial goddess being, you're going to be like, oh my God, really? I don't know. I'm saying like crazy and insane and all that kind of stuff. And it is. But I also have extreme sympathy for people that don't harm people. I don't have any sympathy for Lori and Chad, by the way. I think they're evil pieces of shit, but I digress. But anyway, Chad, he was persuasive. He spoke with calm conviction about secret church history, lost scriptures, and his own visions. And Lori became his most ardent disciple, and then an equal partner in promoting these radical beliefs. And they began performing prayer rituals they called castings, essentially exorcism ceremonies where a group would pray and use energy to expel evil spirits from identified, quote unquote, dark individuals. And these sessions often targeted people close to Lori, whom she had begun to view as obstacles or threats. And those people were her husband, Charles, and even her own children, for example. So through 2019, Chad and Lori increasingly lived in a self-constructed world of prophecy and paranoia, where they alone knew God's true plan, and where extreme actions could be not only justified, but divinely mandated. So Chad and Lori's fringe ideas didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were nurtured by an existing network of doomsday preachers and prepper conferences. And in the LDS community, there was a circuit of podcasts, books, and lecture series under themes like preparing a people that catered to those fascinated by end-of-days prophecy. So it didn't just come from anywhere. It was, the LDS was preaching this to some capacity, but Chad and Lori just took it to the extreme. So Chad became a minor celebrity in these circles. And he spoke at events and appeared on podcasts discussing his near-death experiences and end-of-times visions, attracting followers who found him insightful or, at least, entertaining. And the Preparing a People organization, which was essentially a media/podcast group, hosted many of these conferences and initially featured Chad prominently. And Lori Vallow, for her part, eagerly jumped into this world. So around 2017 to 2018, she was increasingly reading books on LDS prophecy and listening to podcasts by excommunicated LDS members who claimed special knowledge of the end times. And it was through these channels Lori met individuals like Melanie Gibb, who co-hosted a podcast with her, and Zulema Pastenis, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, who shared or at least tolerated these extreme spiritual discussions. So Lori was soon co-hosting podcasts alongside Chad and others, spreading their doctrine to online audiences. And on these shows, they spoke about urgent preparedness, spiritual warfare against demons, and coming transformation of the world. And they started referring to a select group of believers as the Church of the Firstborn, which Chad claimed to lead as the head prophet. How convenient for Chad. And it's important to note this was not an official church, but rather an informal sect or group that recognized Chad's authority. So within this inner circle, a small but devoted following formed by late 2018 and into 2019. And participants included Lori's brother, Alex Cox, Lori's niece, Melanie Pawlowski, Melanie Gibb, and Zulema Pastenis, among others. And they would meet to discuss spiritual revelations, perform the aforementioned casting ceremonies, and reinforce each other's belief in Chad and Lori's special roles. And Lori and Chad taught their followers how to detect if someone was possessed by a dark spirit, or the so-called zombies, and would even identify specific people as being taken over by evil. And disturbingly, by mid-2019, they had labeled several people close to them dark or zombies, including Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, Lori's children, Tylee and JJ, and Chad's wife, Tammy, and Lori's nephew-in-law, Brandon Bardreau. This all just sounds like a very convenient ploy to get the people closest to them and who are in the way out of the way, aka evil. And to the group, these individuals were obstacles to God's plan and perhaps better off dead. And Alex Cox, in particular, was deeply influenced. And he believed wholly in the threat of demonic possession and saw himself as Lori's protector or warrior, ready to deal with these zombies if necessary. The movement around Chad and Lori had all the hallmarks of a cult, as we know. We have a charismatic duo claiming exclusive truth, apocalyptic urgency, dehumanization of outsiders as evil, and the encouragement of extreme measures for a higher cause. And as one commentator put it, Chad and Lori essentially created a quote-unquote Mormon fanfic, a radicalized, fictionalized spin on LDS beliefs taken to violent extremes. So by the time 2019 rolled around, this doomsday cult mindset had fully consumed them and their core followers. And it was only a matter of time before these beliefs turned into action with deadly consequences. All right, let's step away from the heavy stuff for a minute and talk about something that everyone does, and that's eating. For me, putting the best food into my body has been really important lately, and one of my favorite things to eat is seafood. And when was the last time you truly trusted seafood you brought home? I know I question it every single time, from nutrition and taste to sustainability, until I discovered Wild Alaskan Company. Tea. Close to them for sponsoring this episode and supporting this channel, and let's get back to it. So 2019 saw an escalation of events around Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, as people close to them began to die or disappear under suspicious circumstances. And the timeline of key incidences is as follows. So in early 2019, Lori's marriage to Charles was rapidly deteriorating, as we know. And in January of 2019, police were called when Charles grew concerned about Lori's mental state, because she had made bizarre claims about being a divine being and vanished for nearly 2 months, abandoning her kids and her husband, only to return as if nothing happened. And in February of 2019, Charles Vallow filed for divorce. And he told the court that Lori believed she was a god preparing for the second coming, and that the apocalypse was near, and that she had threatened to kill him if he interfered with her mission. And although Charles later withdrew the divorce petition, hoping to reconcile, he confided in family that he feared for his safety, and Lori's behavior was growing more and more extreme under Chad's influence. And she even told Charles he had become a dark spirit named Ned Schneider, who had taken over his body. I didn't realize these zombies had, names. It's strange, but okay. But these ominous accusations just set the stage for what was to come next. So on a summer morning in Chandler, Arizona, Lori's brother, Alex Cox, shot and killed Charles Vallow, Lori's fourth husband. And the official story given to police was that Charles had come to pick up JJ, his kid, at Lori's house, gotten into a confrontation, and hit Alex with a baseball bat, leading Alex to Charles in supposed self-defense. And Lori and Tylee were present in the house at the time of this altercation, though allegedly Tylee had left the house with JJ before the shooting occurred. But after the shooting, Lori made no effort to call 911. And it was Alex who phoned the police about 43 minutes later, by which time Charles lay dead on the floor. And investigators found Lori's demeanor strangely casual, and she was described as smiling and joking while police processed the scene, an attitude one detective described as quote-unquote oddly nonchalant, given her husband had just been killed. And no charges were filed against Alex at the time, as police initially accepted the self-defense claim. However, subsequent evidence deeply undercut that story. And text messages that were later uncovered show Lori had encouraged Alex days earlier to be like Nephi, who was a Book of Mormon figure who righteously killed an evil man. And this was apparently referring to Charles. And Zulema, Alex's future wife, but at the time girlfriend, testified that when she asked Alex how he felt about killing Charles, he said he didn't feel bad. Quote, Zulema, he was a zombie, unquote. A man lost his life because this monster bitch convinced her brother that he was a zombie? What is happening? And this was not long ago. This was a few years ago. But this indicates Alex was acting under the shared belief that Charles was possessed by a dark entity and that killing him was justified, divinely justified, even merciful in some up way. And Charles' death, ruled self-defense in 2019, would later be revisited by authorities. So after Charles' death, the dominoes continued to fall quickly. See, Lori had access to $1 million in life insurance that Charles carried, or so she thought. Because unbeknownst to her, Charles had changed the beneficiary to his sister Kay Woodcock in early 2019, explicitly because he feared Lori might kill him for the money, which just makes this whole thing even more sad. Like, I know that they had motive because he was a zombie or something, but I'm sure the money probably helped with that. And for her to do that and just to figure out there's no money in it is just, I mean, I'm glad she got no money out of it, but like, God, just this world is filled with evil people. So within weeks of Charles' shooting, Lori dramatically altered her life. And by late August 2019, Lori left Arizona and moved to Rexburg, Idaho, bringing Tylee, who's 16 at the time, and JJ, who was 7 at the time, and Alex Cox with her. And Chad Daybell lived just outside Rexburg, and it appears Lori was relocating to be near Chad and joined their households. And they told friends they were gathering in Rexburg because it would be a place of refuge during the coming apocalypse. So Lori rented a townhouse in Rexburg with Alex Cox, indicating they continued to operate as a team. And Alex would eventually move into his own townhouse adjacent to Lori. But shortly after the move to Idaho, Lori's 2 children, who were the last major obstacles to the couple's future, vanished under mysterious circumstances. Tylee Ryan, who was 16, was last seen on September 8th, 2019. And on that day, Lori, Alex, Tylee, and JJ took a day trip to Yellowstone National Park. And a photograph of them at the park entrance is the final image of Tylee alive. And data from Alex Cox's cell phone shows that early the next morning, September 9th, Alex was at Chad Daybell's backyard property for roughly 2 hours, specifically in the area of the Daybell family pet cemetery. And that same morning, Chad sent a curious text to his wife, Tammy, claiming he had shot a raccoon and buried it in the pet cemetery. Investigators now believe this was Chad's cover story for why he had dug a grave on the property. In reality, on September 9th, Tylee's life had likely already been taken, murdered by Alex and or Chad, and buried clandestinely in Chad's yard. And Tylee's remains would later be found burned at the site. Just disgusting. I'm just like, I can't believe these people exist. I cannot believe these people exist. Yeah, it's horrifying. And my heart goes out to Tylee and the family that actually loves her. And on September 22nd, 2019, JJ Vallow was seen alive for what would be the last time. JJ, a 7-year-old, had been attending school in Rexburg. Lori enrolled him on September 3rd, but withdrew him after just 3 weeks, saying she would homeschool him. And on September 22nd, JJ was at Lori's apartment when friends, Melanie Gibb and her boyfriend, were visiting. And they later reported that Alex Cox carried a seemingly sleeping JJ into the house that night. And by the next morning, September 23rd, JJ was gone. And Lori told visiting friends that Alex had taken JJ away because the boy had been misbehaving. But in truth, investigators believe JJ was killed that night of September 22nd, asphyxiated by Alex Cox. And phone records show Alex went to Chad's property again on September 23rd for only a short period, likely to bury JJ's body in a shallow grave. So with Tylee and JJ now missing, Lori began a campaign of deceit to pretend everything was fine. She never reported her children missing, by the way. Instead, she just lied to everyone about their whereabouts. And Lori told some people that Tylee was away at BYU and told others that JJ was with relatives back in Arizona. And in late September 2019, Lori even asked her friend Melanie Gibb to tell police, if asked, that JJ was staying with her in Arizona. So it's not just their mother, it is friends, it is adults co-conspirating together about the murder of children. And this falsehood was tested in late November when police indeed came knocking. So not long after the children vanished, another violent act struck someone connected to Lori, and that was Brandon Boudreau, the ex-husband of Lori's niece, Melanie. And on October 2nd in Gilbert, Arizona, Brandon was shot at in front of his home by someone driving a Jeep registered to late Charles Vallow. And the bullet narrowly missed Brandon's head, and he survived and called police, identifying the vehicle. And Brandon had been vocal that Melanie fell in with Lori's cult and that he feared for his life. And authorities suspect Alex Cox was the triggerman in the attempted murder, likely on Lori and Chad's orders, using Charles' Jeep. And this was part of what prosecutors later described as Lori's pattern: eliminate people seen as dark or as obstacles. And Brandon might have been perceived as a dark influence, keeping Melanie from fully joining Lori's fold. And he was also the beneficiary of a life insurance policy that Melanie might gain if he died. Just cult, classic cult, just gathering people's money and gathering people to do their bidding, just evil. And Melanie had embraced Lori and Chad's teachings, and she abruptly moved to Rexburg in October to be closer to them. So while Brandon survived, the shooter was not immediately caught, and this incident would remain unsolved until the broader case unraveled. So on the evening of October 9th, Chad's wife, Tamara, or Tammy Daybell, had a frightening encounter, and she called 911 and reported that a masked man approached her in her driveway and shot at her with what she thought was a paintball gun. So Tammy was shaken but unharmed, as the gun apparently misfired or just missed. And she posted about the incident on Facebook, describing the masked figure and asking if anyone knew of teenagers playing pranks. And investigators now believe this was Alex Cox's first attempt to murder Tammy on behalf of Chad and Lori. And cell phone records place Alex in the vicinity of the Daybell home that night. And Lori, Zulema, and Melanie were together when they received a phone call informing them of the attempt. And Zulema recalled Lori reacting with anger, saying, quote, "He can't do anything right," unquote, likely referring to Alex failing to kill Tammy. So this foiled attempt was a grim foreshadowing, because 10 days later, tragedy would strike. And Tammy Daybell, aged 49, died suddenly in her sleep on October 19th at the Daybell home in Salem, Idaho. And Chad claimed Tammy had retired the night before with a terrible cough and just never woke up. And when he called 911, he described it as a peaceful death. But Tammy was allegedly a very healthy, active woman, so this was incredibly shocking. Nevertheless, the Fremont County coroner initially ruled Tammy's death natural, and this was without an autopsy based on Chad's account that she had been ill, which is insane given the overall numerous deaths that are happening around this family. But Tammy's body would be buried in Springville, Utah on October 22nd, and the family held a brief memorial in Idaho as well. At the time, no one suspected foul play for some reason, except perhaps those in Chad and Lori's inner circle, of course, because Lori had been telling friends for months that Chad's wife would die early. And she even confidently stated Tammy would be out of the picture soon. And Chad had supposedly foreseen Tammy's death, and now it appeared those predictions came true. He murdered her. So investigators believe Tammy was murdered by asphyxiation, and likely Chad and Alex conspired to make it happen. And when Tammy's body was exhumed in December of 2019, a later autopsy concluded she died by homicidal suffocation, not a health issue. So just 2 weeks after Tammy's death, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow were married in an idyllic beach ceremony in Kauai, Hawaii. Married. 2 weeks after. Just not suspicious. I know that she was exhumed and they found it out later, but my God, they're just screaming, "We killed her." And how disrespectful. It's, again, just evil, 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 evil people. And the destination wedding was small and quiet. And Lori sported a white dress and a new ring. And significantly, Lori had purchased her wedding ring on October 2nd, weeks before Tammy even died. And that ring was ordered via Charles Vallow's Amazon account, her late husband's Amazon account. These people can't get more disgusting. I can't. It was just an eerie detail showing all sorts of premeditation. And for Chad to remarry so quickly was shocking to those who knew him, because Tammy had been his wife of 29 years. And yet within days, he was exchanging vows with Lori on a sunny beach in Hawaii. And back in Idaho, Chad told neighbors that Lori was an empty nester with no young kids, and Lori claimed Tylee had died years earlier, which are blatant falsehoods to cover up the absence of their children, their deceased children. And in a final twist to 2019's cascade of suspicious deaths, Alex Cox himself died on December 12th, 2019, at the age of 51. And earlier that month, events had started catching up with Lori and Chad. And Alex had married Zulema Pastenis on December 1st, and they were in the Phoenix area, specifically Gilbert, Arizona. And on December 11th, news broke that Tammy Daybell's body had been exhumed for an autopsy. And Chad and Lori reportedly called Alex that day, informing him and perhaps panicking about what might be found. You know, the consequences of their actions. And according to Zulema's later account, that night, Alex was extremely upset and mumbled to her, quote, "I think I'm being their fall guy," unquote. Yeah, you're their puppet, you idiot. Which I have no sympathy for him either. He murdered kids. And less than 24 hours later, after he said that to his new wife, Alex collapsed in his new wife's bathroom and died. And the cause was officially blood clots in his lungs, complicated by high blood pressure. And the Maricopa County Medical Examiner ruled Alex's death natural causes. However, given the extraordinary pattern of deaths around Lori, Some have wondered if Alex was poisoned or if stress simply caught up with him. I'm gonna guess he was murdered, but what do I know? I can only put the pieces together. 1 + 1 = 2, I think. But either way, Alex died with many secrets. And Zulema mentioned that a few days prior, Alex told her he had hidden a bag of money in their closet in case anything happens to me. It's as if Alex foresaw that the walls were closing in on him. So by the end of 2019, Chad and Lori had left a wake of tragedy. Lori's husband, Charles, was dead. Lori's 2 children were missing, and unbeknownst to anyone then, murdered. And Chad's wife, Tammy, was dead. And Alex, who had likely carried out 2 of those killings, was now dead as well. But authorities were finally on their trail, thanks in large part to concerned family members asking tough questions. So the stage was set for the investigation to break the case open. So after months of deceit and evasion by Chad and Lori, the disappearance of the 2 children, JJ and Tylee, became impossible to hide. And law enforcement, spurred by worried relatives, began an intense investigation in early 2020 that would ultimately expose the couple's horrific deeds. So extended family sounded the alarm. Kay and Larry Woodcock, JJ's grandparents, had grown increasingly worried after not hearing from the normally bubbly 7-year-old for months. And Kay Woodcock, Charles Vallo's sister, knew something was very, very wrong when Lori cut off all communication. And on November 26 of 2019, prompted by the Woodcocks, the Rexburg Police Department performed a welfare check at Lori's townhouse in Idaho, looking for JJ. And Lori coolly told officers that JJ was safe and staying with a friend, Melanie Gibb, in Arizona. So police would reach out to Melanie Gibb, who would lie to police on behalf of Lori because Lori told her to do so. But luckily, she soon recanted and revealed that JJ was not with her at all. And by the next day, November 27th, Rexburg police returned with a search warrant, only to find that Lori and Chad had fled. And the couple took off from Idaho, leaving behind all of Lori's kids' belongings, and later were traced to Hawaii. And this abandonment of their homes and children's stuff raised every red flag for investigators. Finally. So on December 20th, 2019, police publicly announced that JJ and Tylee were missing and in danger. And this press release and subsequent plea for tips generated a huge outpouring of information from the public. And the mysterious case of the Doomsday Mom, as the media dubbed Lori, and her missing kids dominated headlines. And investigators revealed that they believed the children's disappearance was linked to Tammy Daybell's suspicious death. And Chad and Lori, through a lawyer, issued a statement on December 23rd denying wrongdoing and professing their love for their kids, but notably did not produce the children or say where they were. Suspicious. And as the year ended, police were openly criticizing Lori and Chad's lack of cooperation, calling it astonishing and pleading with them to do the right thing. But remember, they're evil pieces of shit. So the search intensified and the FBI became involved. And on January 3rd, 2020, investigators with the FBI's assistance raided Chad Daybell's Salem, Idaho property for the first time, seizing computers, cell phones, journals, and documents as evidence. And on January 7th, Larry and Kay Woodcock flew to Rexburg and held a very emotional press conference, offering $20,000 in reward for any information leading to JJ and Tylee's safe return. And the Woodcocks implored anyone with knowledge to come forward, with Larry famously pleading, quote, "All I want is just to see those children," unquote. And this public appeal kept the pressure on law enforcement and on Chad and Lori, who remained in hiding in Hawaii. So authorities finally pinned down Lori and Chad's location in Kauai, Hawaii. And police in Kauai served Lori on January 25th with a court order from Idaho demanding that she produce JJ and Tylee within 5 days to prove they were alive and well. Why is it 5 days? Why isn't it immediately? These are kids. I don't understand our judicial system. I really don't. But this was essentially a last chance given to Lori. And if it was all a misunderstanding, she could clear it up by simply showing the children. The deadline of January 30th came and went, and Lori failed to present the kids to the authorities. And during this Hawaii period, East Idaho news reporter Nate Eaton dramatically confronted Lori and Chad in a parking lot, asking them point blank,
"Can you tell me where your kids are? Where are your kids?" No comment? They've been missing for 4 months. You have nothing to say? You're over here in Hawaii? Where are your children?
And the clip of Lori smirking and stonewalling went viral. Just evil bitch. Further painting her in the public eye as either delusional or nefarious. But with Lori defying the court order, Idaho authorities prepared to move against her. So Kauai police, acting on an Idaho warrant, arrested Lori Vallow on February 20th. And in early March 2020, Lori was flown back to Rexburg in handcuffs, where crowds and media awaited her arrival. But despite arrests, Lori still refused to disclose the fate or whereabouts of JJ and Tylee. And Chad, who was not immediately arrested, continued to support her. But suspicion was mounting that the children had met a grim end, especially as no verified sightings of them had occurred since September. But still, investigators held out hope that they might find the kids alive as they continued gathering evidence. But as we know, they wouldn't. So during the spring, the case quietly progressed as prosecutors and law enforcement built their case. And they combed through digital data and newly obtained evidence. And in April of 2020, a letter from the Idaho Attorney General became public, revealing that Lori and Chad were now under investigation, not just for desertion, but for conspiracy to commit murder in the case of Charles Vallow, Tylee, JJ, and Tammy Daybell. And this was a strong signal that authorities suspected Chad and Lori of being behind multiple deaths. And meanwhile, Lori remained jailed, unable to post her lowered $1 million bail bond. And Chad had quietly returned to Idaho, yet to be arrested. And the investigation's breakthrough came on June 9th. Acting on new evidence, likely a combination of Alex's cell phone, GPS data, and Chad's odd texts about the raccoon, the FBI, Rexburg Police, and Fremont County Sheriff's Office swarmed Chad Daybell's property with a search warrant. And they focused on areas of interest in the yard identified via technology and previous searches. And within a few hours, investigators made that gruesome discovery. And that was the human remains buried in a shallow grave on Chad's land. So by midday, as this news broke, Chad Daybell attempted to flee, and he got in his SUV and drove off. But officers stopped him about a mile away and took him into custody. And the remains were sent to the lab for identification, and on June 13th, the heart-wrenching confirmation came to the public. And that was that the remains were those of 7-year-old JJ Vallow and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan. And the way in which they were buried matched the disturbing activities implied by Alex's September phone pings and Chad's texts about shooting a raccoon. And for months, Chad and Lori had lied to everyone as their children's bodies lay hidden in Chad's backyard. But the discovery answered the agonizing question of where the kids were, but raised another, and that was why. And this was a question that would be addressed in court. And a memorial was later set up on the fence just down the road from Chad Daybell's property in Salem, Idaho, where the remains of Tylee and JJ were recovered. And the memorial's photographs, flowers, and a sign reading "Justice for Tylee and JJ" bore witness to the end of a desperate search and the beginning of a quest for justice. So on June 9th, immediately after the remains were found, police booked Chad Daybell into Fremont County Jail. And for a brief time, both Lori and Chad sat in Idaho's jails, accused but not yet formally charged with murder. But now, with the children's bodies recovered, the case shifted fully into criminal prosecution phase. And the mystery was over, and the task now was to hold those responsible to account. And the heinous nature of these crimes, filicide and spousal murder driven by bizarre cult beliefs, would ensure that the trials to come garnered international attention. So from the outset, the Vallow Daybell case was one fueled and followed by a massive online audience. Both Chad and Lori had notable digital footprints that played into this investigation and public fascination. Chad had an extensive online presence through his doomsday fiction and prepper community activities, and he appeared on podcasts, spoke in YouTube videos from Preparing a People conferences, and moderated forums about end-time prophecies. And through these channels, he reached a wide audience of LDS fringe enthusiasts even before his crimes. And Chad co-hosted a podcast and gave interviews where he calmly discussed his visions of the apocalypse. And these recordings later became key for investigators to understand his mindset and for the public to hear, in his own voice, the extreme beliefs that underpinned the murders. And Lori, allegedly, as her accounts have since been deleted, too, had been active on social media, though in a different way. Because prior to things falling apart, Lori's Facebook and Instagram accounts painted a picture of a fun-loving mom, and she shared smiling photos of Tylee and JJ on family trips and posts about her faith. But after meeting Chad, Lori's social media shifted, and she posted cryptic spiritual messages, and by late 2019, she had gone mostly dark online. But still, digital evidence of their activities was everywhere. And one particularly important aspect was the digital trail of their travels. And when Lori and Chad abruptly left Idaho and flew to Hawaii in late 2019, they left a trail of electronic records. Things like airline bookings, hotel check-ins, and social media snapshots. And remarkably, they appeared almost carefree in Hawaii, seemingly untroubled by the storm building around them. And Lori even made inquiries about renting a place in Hawaii for long term, as if planning a new life, as if the consequences wouldn't catch up with them. All the while, her children were nowhere in sight, and she knew that they were gone. And photos of Lori and Chad in Hawaii surfaced on social media and news sites, enraging the public. Because how could these two relax in paradise while refusing to say where their kids were? So these images and posts became a huge source of pressure. Law enforcement was monitoring their online moves as well. And one could say that Chad and Lori's own social media trail helped incriminate them, as it showed Lori basking in wedding bliss when she claimed her kids were safe elsewhere. And Chad and Lori's online communications provided evidence as well. And investigators subpoenaed their cloud data, finding correspondence between the two where they discussed spiritual justifications for getting rid of obstacles. And they found that Chad had texted Lori love stories in the days after Charles' death. Essentially chapters of a steamy James and Elena romance novel paralleling their affair. And they also found that Lori used Charles' Amazon account to shop for things like a wedding ring, and transactions timestamped while Tammy was still alive. And all these digital breadcrumbs became a crucial part of the evidence that authorities pieced together to reveal the conspiracy. And the online religious community that initially supported Chad and Lori also turned on them as the scandal broke. And websites and forums that had once hosted Chad's writings suddenly disavowed them. Oh no, don't want karma to bite them. But in my opinion, they're just as bad. And podcasts that Lori and Chad appeared on were removed or flooded with comments from horrified listeners once the news of the missing children spread. So while the internet and social platforms helped them gain influence at first, in the end, those same platforms amplified their downfall, spreading awareness and outrage about their crimes at lightning speed. And as the case gained notoriety, thousands of citizen sleuths across the country took to the internet to help unravel the mystery, because this was a true crime saga that played out in real time on social media. And Facebook groups dedicated to finding JJ and Tylee sprang up almost overnight in late 2019. And these groups quickly amassed members who traded theories, shared public documents, and kept the spotlight on the missing kids. So these Facebook communities just became a crowdsourced research hub. And Reddit was another platform buzzing with activity, and a subreddit dedicated to the case featured detailed timelines and analysis compiled by users, some of whom had investigative or legal backgrounds and could provide insight into court procedures and charges. And contributors on Reddit painstakingly pieced together the family tree, explained LDS doctrinal references that popped up, and even crowdsourced a timeline of events. And they debated motives and means, all while keeping the case in the public eye. So every development, from indictments to court hearings to leaked documents, was immediately dissected by thousands of eyes. And nothing Lori or Chad did escaped notice once this internet army mobilized. So this groundswell of online interest had real impacts, and it likely pressured law enforcement and prosecutors to act swiftly and transparently, knowing the public was closely watching. And the social media fervor also meant that potential witnesses or people with information were more likely to come forward. And Lori's friend, Melanie Gibb, who had initially lied for Lori, contacted police in early December of 2019 to admit Lori had asked her to lie about JJ's whereabouts. And Melanie's crucial information about that was a turning point that helped police zero in on Lori's deception. And though not confirmed, it's plausible that seeing the case everywhere and people clamoring for truth gave her the push to do the right thing. But not all citizen sleuthing was helpful. And some internet vigilantes started spreading rumors and misinformation, which is a common pitfall in high-profile cases. And by and large, however, the Facebook and Reddit communities kept their focus on facts, often sharing links to official documents and credible news sources. And the true crime community's mobilization ensured that national media and thus authorities couldn't drop the ball on the case. So citizen sleuths had followed Vallow and Daybell as they traveled to Hawaii, sharing updates with their followers and law enforcement, and ultimately helping lead to her arrest, which is insane and awesome. It was very much a 21st century phenomenon. So the successful prosecution of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell hinged heavily on a mountain of digital evidence, because investigators gathered an extraordinary array of electronic data, which, when woven together, created an incontrovertible tapestry of guilt. Because these people were f***ing idiots, thankfully. And cell phone GPS and location data was perhaps the most damning technological evidence, because the FBI's Cellular Analysis Survey team, otherwise known as CAST, pored over Alex Cox's phone records, and these records provided timestamps and GPS coordinates showing exactly where Alex's phone was during critical moments. And Alex's phone placed him in Chad's backyard for 2 hours on the morning of September 9th, as we know, which lined up with the burial of Tylee. And on September 23rd, Alex's phone pinged near Chad's pond for only 17 minutes, correlating with the time frame of JJ's burial. And this kind of hard data was presented in court via detailed maps, which were essentially tech eyewitnesses to the crimes. And without it, Chad and Lori might have continued to claim ignorance about what had happened to the kids. But it's hard to argue with a GPS dot showing your co-conspirator's phone in your yard right when a murder likely occurred. Not to mention, text messages, emails, and even metadata from photos also played a huge role in the case, as investigators recovered a text Chad sent to Tammy on September 9th about burying a raccoon, as we know. And that harmless-sounding message became sinister in context, establishing that Chad was trying to cover up activity on his property. And police also found text exchanges between Lori, Chad, and Alex discussing people by code names or referring to evil spirits. And in one haunting set of messages, Lori and Chad mused about, quote, a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children, unquote, strongly suggesting premeditation of the murders. And Charles Vallow's old emails, like the ones to Tammy's, and Lori and Chad's texts under aliases were all recovered through search warrants. And these provided direct insight into their plotting and state of mind. And financial records accessed digitally offered more proof of motive, because investigators showed that after Charles' death, Lori immediately attempted to claim his life insurance, only to find the beneficiary had been changed to Kay Woodcock, as mentioned before. Similarly, they documented Chad's rush to increase Tammy's life insurance in September of 2019 to the maximum allowed. And Lori also kept collecting Social Security benefits that were issued for Tylee and JJ from the deaths of Joseph, Ryan, and Charles, respectively, even after the children were dead. You're a disgusting human being. But this just established a financial motive. And beyond religious reasons, they stood to gain money from these deaths. And these digital financial logs painted a picture of greed. And surveillance footage from various locations filled in more blanks. And investigators obtained CCTV video from the self-storage facility in Rexburg where Lori had hastily rented a unit in October of 2019. And the footage showed Lori, Alex, and Chad in various combinations visiting the unit multiple times, dropping off a number of different things including boxes and children's items like bikes and scooters and more. And this indicated Lori was stashing the kids' belongings, perhaps to hide evidence of their absence. And police later found that storage unit untouched, full of JJ and Tylee's keepsakes abandoned. So this whole case, Lori and Chad's case, was very much a 21st century investigation, because without the cell phone records, computer forensics, and online paper trail, this might have remained a circumstantial case. And with them, law enforcement was able to assemble a meticulous chronology and motive for each crime. And if there is a heart in this tragic saga, it is embodied by Kay and Larry Woodcock, the grandparents of little JJ Vallow. And Kay is the biological grandmother of JJ, and she's Charles Vallow's sister. And she and Larry cared for JJ as an infant before Charles and Lori adopted him. And the Woodcocks adored JJ and remained very involved in his life even after adoption. And it was Kay Woodcock's early suspicion that first alerted the world that JJ and Tylee were in danger. And in the months after Charles' July 2019 death, Lori had all but cut off the Woodcocks from contact with JJ, offering one thin excuse after another. But by late summer of 2019, Kay sensed something was amiss. And at first, she thought Lori might be having a breakdown or hiding the kids due to some custody dispute. But as weeks turned into months with only vague updates, Kay's worry deepened. And come fall, Kay began reaching out to authorities in both Arizona and Idaho, reporting that she couldn't reach her grandson. So it was Kay's tenacity that directly led Rexburg police to perform the late November 2019 welfare check that exposed the lies about the children's whereabouts. And when the children's remains were discovered in June 2020, Kay and Larry were absolutely devastated. Yet even in their grief, they stood front and center at press briefings. And while it wasn't the outcome they had hoped, at least now they could lay the kids to rest. And the Woodcocks continued to be pillars of strength during Lori's trial in 2023. And they attended nearly every single hearing. And Kay even took the witness stand to recount how Charles had confided in her before his death that he feared Lori's cult-like ideas. And Larry gave a powerful victim impact statement telling her directly,
I truly wish I was there to look the murderers in the eyes. I'm unable to. I will say this, murderers, you're nothing. You're a murderer. You're a narcissist, psychopath, delusional murderer.
All you need to say. Well said. And the Woodcocks' unwavering fight for truth not only cracked the case open, but kept the memory of JJ and Tylee alive to the public. And then there's Colby Ryan. And Colby Ryan is Lori's eldest child, born from her second marriage, and the older half-brother to Tylee and adoptive brother to JJ. And Colby's role in this tragedy is complex, because he loved his mother, yet ultimately he became a key figure in questioning her and aiding investigators. And initially, when suspicions first arose, Colby defended Lori. Yet Lori had told Colby a variety of lies. At one point, she claimed Tylee was busy at college and that JJ was with his grandparents, and Colby just wanted to believe her. But by late 2019, he grew alarmed, and he realized he hadn't actually spoken to Tylee in a really long time. And the last texts he got from Tylee's phone in the fall were strangely stilted, not in her voice, and full of odd excuses. So Colby told police that when he expressed worry in text to Tylee, he got brief replies saying she was safe but busy, which struck him as very unlike his sister. And those messages were likely Lori or someone else impersonating Tylee after she was already dead. And as 2020 began and Lori refused to tell anyone where the kids were, Colby publicly broke his silence. And in media interviews, a distraught Colby pleaded with Lori to do the right thing and tell what happened. And he recorded heart-wrenching YouTube videos addressing his mom, saying she wasn't the same person and begging her to save her children's lives by revealing the truth. And these public statements from Colby were significant, and they undercut Lori's narrative that everything was fine. But Colby would fully cooperate with investigators, and perhaps Colby's most dramatic contribution came in mid-2020, when he agreed to participate in a recorded jailhouse phone call with Lori once she was arrested. And this call was later played for the jury at Lori's trial. And in it, Colby emotionally confronts his mother, demanding she tell him if his siblings are alive. And Lori evades and offers bizarre religious platitudes. At one point, Colby tells her that God will punish her for the things that she has done, and Lori shockingly just laughs on the phone because, she's f***ing evil. And that disturbing audio lets jurors hear Lori's coldness and detachment in her own voice. And Colby telling her, "I don't know a murderous mother," drove home how far into delusion Lori had sunk. But he no longer knew who she was. And it was powerful evidence of Lori's lack of remorse or accountability, just strengthening the prosecution's case that she was the mastermind, not an unwitting dupe of Chad. So by the time of Lori's 2023 trial, Colby was firmly in the role of survivor advocate, and he took to the stand as a witness for the state, introducing the family to the jury and describing the love he had for Tylee and JJ, painting a human picture of the victims beyond the grisly details. And he recounted how Lori had been loving mom when he was younger, but how around 2018 he saw a radical change as she got into Chad's teachings. And his testimony about Lori's personality shift and the way she'd start talking about zombies and evil spirits just set the stage for understanding the motive. And he expressed grief and also anger, saying that Tylee and JJ deserved so much better. And in the end, Colby, having lost his entire family, stood as a figure of resilience. And his willingness to confront his mother and cooperate with the law enforcement was crucial in achieving justice for his siblings, showing even for within Lori's family, there were those who would hold her accountable. So Lori was initially charged for 2 counts of felony child desertion for willfully abandoning Tylee and JJ, and misdemeanors for obstruction, lying to police, solicitation, and contempt of court. And at her extradition hearing in Hawaii, Lori notably appeared unmoved, and she ultimately waived extradition and was flown back to Idaho on March 5th, 2020, under armed guard. And in her initial Idaho court appearance, the judge reduced bail from $5 million to $1 million after the defense emphasized Lori's low flight risk as she was prominent in the public eye. But unable to post bond, as we know, Lori remained in jail. And importantly, at this point, she was not yet charged with murder or conspiracy to murder, as the authorities were still assembling that case. Chad would be booked on 2 felony counts of concealment of evidence and or destruction of evidence for hiding the bodies of Tylee and JJ. And in his first court appearance, Chad's bail was also set to $1 million, with both Lori and Chad behind bars by mid-2020. And prosecutors moved methodically to upgrade charges as new evidence came in and grand juries convened. And initially, Lori and Chad faced a somewhat convoluted list of charges. Lori had child desertion, obstruction, and related counts, while Chad had evidence concealment. And over the summer of 2020, additional charges were tacked on. And in June, Lori was also charged with conspiracy to conceal evidence once it was clear she and Chad acted together. So everyone anticipated more serious charges pending the completion of Tammy's autopsy and further investigation. And in early 2021, authorities in Fremont County, where Tammy died, and Madison County, where the kids were killed, coordinated to present the case to a grand jury. So on May 24th, 2021, an Idaho grand jury indicted Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell on multiple counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and finally directly accusing them of killing 17-year-old Tylee and 7-year-old JJ, and 49-year-old Tammy Daybell. And this was a sweeping indictment covering all 3 murders, as well as related charges of insurance fraud for Chad collecting Tammy's life insurance, and grand theft for Lori continuing to draw Social Security benefits on the kids after their deaths. And at a press conference on May 25th, prosecutors made the stunning announcement public, outlining how Lori, Chad, and Alex Cox, now deceased, conspired in a plot driven by radical beliefs and greed. Essentially, they allege that Lori and Chad used their cult-like religious teachings to justify murdering Lori's children and Chad's wife, in part to remove obstacles to their relationship and also to collect financial benefits. And Lori, still in jail, and Chad, who by then had also remained incarcerated, both had initial court appearances on these new charges and pleaded not guilty, believe it or not. Almost like they're narcissistic psychopathic assholes or something. And in Idaho, these murder charges made them eligible for the death penalty, which the state quickly signaled it would pursue, at least for Chad. However, shortly after the indictment, there was a pause in proceedings for Lori. And in June 2021, Lori Vallow was declared incompetent to stand trial by a psychological evaluator. And the judge agreed that Lori was not currently able to assist in her own defense, so on June 8th, 2021, she was committed to the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare for restorative treatment. And the details of her mental condition weren't made public, but it was reported that she might have been diagnosed with a depressive or delusional disorder, and this commitment meant a delay until she could be deemed fit, essentially hitting pause on Lori's case. But Chad's case, meanwhile, proceeded on track, and his attorneys entered not guilty pleas on his behalf on all counts and started the long process of pretrial motions. And for about 10 months, Lori underwent treatment, and by April 11th, 2022, the court found Lori Vallow competent to stand trial. Almost like she was stalling or something, because she's evil or something. And she was returned to the county jail to face her charges. And at her arraignment on April 19th, 2022, Lori refused to enter a plea, standing mute. so the judge entered a not guilty plea for her on all counts. Now, with both defendants on the same page legally, the case moved toward a joint trial until another twist separated them again. And prosecutors initially planned to try Lori and Chad together in one big trial, giving the overlapping evidence. And they even announced in mid-2022 that they would seek the death penalty for Lori as well, just as they would for Chad. However, Chad's team wanted more time to prepare, given that they had nothing to go on because he's guilty. And Chad waived his right to a speedy trial, while Lori asserted hers. So this led Chad's lawyer to successfully argue in late 2022 that the cases should be severed, and Chad's trial would be postponed and Lori's would proceed first in 2023. Additionally, just weeks before Lori's trial in 2023, the judge removed the death penalty as a possibility for her, citing that her defense didn't have adequate time to review some late arriving DNA evidence if a death sentence was on the table. So Lori would be tried for her life, but with a maximum penalty of life imprisonment rather than execution. So the decision to hold separate trials meant that Lori Vallow Daybell went before a jury in 2023, and Chad Daybell would follow with his in 2024. And each trial was its own media spectacle, revealing the disturbing details to the entire world. But Lori's trial commenced in early April of 2023 in Boise, Idaho. The prosecution painted Lori as a woman driven by money, power, and and who used her doomsday cult beliefs to manipulate those around her into removing any obstacle to what she wanted. And over the course of 4 weeks, the state called roughly 60 witnesses, and jurors heard heart-wrenching testimony from law enforcement describing the condition of Tylee and JJ's remains, and they saw photos of the pet cemetery burn pit where Tylee's bones had been reduced to nothing. And the graphic nature of this evidence was such that Lori at one point asked to be excused from the courtroom when photos were shown. And that request was luckily denied by the judge because she should have to look at what she did to her children. And perhaps most damning was Lori's own recorded jail call that we talked about before with Colby, where her indifferent attitude and bizarre laughter at being accused of murder likely made a poor impression on the jury. And Lori's defense, notably, called no witness of their own, because they didn't have any. She's an evil person. But their whole defense was that Chad Daybell had a dark influence on Lori, but this would fall flat, because she's an adult woman who can make her own decisions. And on May 12th, 2023, the jury found Lori Vallow Daybell guilty on all counts, including the murders of Tylee and JJ and conspiracy in Tammy's murder, plus grand theft. And the evidence of her active participation and leadership in the conspiracy was overwhelming. And Lori showed little reaction as the verdict was read. And in late July 2023, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, receiving 5 separate life sentences, 3 to be served consecutively for the murders and 2 concurrently for conspiracy. And at her sentencing, Judge Stephen Boise admonished her in scathing terms, saying, quote, "You chose the most evil and destructive path possible," unquote. And he said, describing how she justified the killings by going down a bizarre religious rabbit hole. And Lori, in a rambling statement, still professed her innocence and said bizarrely that her children were happy in heaven and no one was actually murdered. And remarks that only reinforce the perception that she remains deeply delusional or in denial. Quote, "Jesus Christ knows that no one was murdered in this case. Accidental deaths happen. Suicides happen. Fatal side effects from medications happen," unquote. Just batshit, man. Following her Idaho conviction, Lori was extradited to Arizona to finally face charges for Charles' murder and the attempt on Brandon Berdrew, where she would eventually also be found guilty of both in 2025, adding additional life sentences. And she was found guilty for conspiring to murder Charles on April 22nd and for conspiring to murder Brandon on June 12th. And she was given 2 additional life sentences on July 25th. And then there was Chad. And Chad Daybell's trial took place about a year after Lori's, in April and May of 2024, also in Boise due to the change of venue. And Chad, unlike Lori, had the death penalty on the table, which raised the stakes significantly. And his defense strategy diverged from Lori's, and they squarely pinned most of the blame on Lori and Alex. And in opening statements, Chad's lawyer painted him as a misguided religious man who was seduced and controlled by Lori, arguing that Lori was the mastermind and that Chad was guilty perhaps of being foolish, but not murder. What? Not murder, even though there's like 1,000 pieces of evidence. The prosecution, by contrast, portrayed Chad as equally culpable and driven by base motives and emphasizing the insurance money he gained from Tammy's death. And many witnesses and much of the evidence was similar to Lori's trial, given the overlap. And one new element in Chad's trial, though, was the focus on Tammy's murder. And jurors heard from Chad and Tammy's children, Emma and Garth, about how their mother's health had gotten worse near her death. However, jurors also heard from Tammy's family and friends about how shocked they were at her sudden death, considering how healthy she had seemed leading up to it, reinforcing the homicide finding. And they also heard of Chad's behavior after Tammy's death, like moving in with Lori and their marriage days after, which undercut any notion of him as a passive pawn. So on May 30th of 2024, after deliberation, the jury found Chad Daybell guilty on all counts as well, and the first-degree murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, plus conspiracy and insurance fraud. So having seen the same mountain of evidence, they did not buy the idea that Chad was just Lori's victim. And the trial then proceeded to a penalty phase because the death penalty was sought. And on June 1st, 2024, the judge formally sentenced Chad Daybell to death for the 3 murders, plus additional years for the other charges. And Chad reportedly showed little emotion as the sentence was handed down because he's a narcissistic psychopath, evil monster, and he was transferred to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution and placed on death row where he belongs. And Idaho hadn't actually conducted an execution in many years, but Chad's sentence sent a strong message given the heinousness of his crimes. And as of 2025, Chad is appealing his conviction and sentence to Idaho Supreme Court, a process that could take years. But in the meantime, he remains behind bars, destined to live out his days in the shadow of the crimes he once thought were divinely sanctioned. And I say, good riddance. And these people deserve to rot. Rot and think about all the things they have done wrong. So, that is that for this case. Heart-wrenching case. My heart goes out to the victims' families and to the children and to the spouses. It's just horrible. Horrible. But please let me know what other cases you want me to deep dive into. I always read the comments. And until I see you next time, stay safe. On a cold February evening in 2008, a young realtor in Victoria, British Columbia prepared for what could have been the biggest sale of her life. The clients were mysterious, wealthy newcomers to the city eager to buy a $1 million house. They found her through a recommendation she couldn't trace, spoken in an accent she wasn't sure was real, and insisted on meeting immediately. And by the next day, Lindsay Buziak would be dead. And 17 years later, their faces are still unknown. And what happened inside that house wasn't just a killing, it was an execution. And someone out there planned it to perfection. This is the story of Lindsay Buziak. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. And today we're getting into kind of a more personal case. Honestly, I was around and alive and knowing what was going on during this case, and it was close to home, and it bothers me that it is still a cold case. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this cold case together. Lindsay Elizabeth Buziak was born on November 2nd, 1983 in Victoria, British Columbia. She was the first daughter of Jeff Buziak, a local real estate agent, and Evelyn Reitmayer, a stay-at-home mom. And in 1986, Lindsay became a big sister when her sibling Sarah was born. And though her parents' marriage ended in the mid-1990s, the divorce did not fracture Lindsay's family bonds, because she would remain close to both her mother and her father as she grew up, luckily. So as a child, Lindsay split time between Victoria and the peaceful summers at Lake Cowichan, where the family kept a trailer at an RV lot. And those summers were filled with laughter and play, and Lindsay's younger sister, Sarah, fondly remembers learning to swim just to keep up with her energetic big sister. And from an early age, Lindsay's personality just sparkled. And she was often described as a happy, outgoing little girl, quote, full of joy, unquote, as her mother recalls. And there was a fashionable flair about her even in childhood. One story even recounts how young Lindsay once begged for grape-flavored bubblegum simply because it matched her purple outfit, which is absolutely adorable. And her mother would gently refuse, saying she would buy what Lindsay needed, not just what she wanted. But ever resourceful, Lindsay took that as motivation, and by her early teens, she landed her very first job at Sirens, which was a trendy clothing store in Victoria's Mall. And Lindsay was determined to earn the things she wanted. Just a hint at the ambition that would later define her. So Lindsay grew up in the greater Victoria area and attended local schools, including Royal Oak Middle School and Reynolds Secondary School in her teen years. And in school, she became known for an infectious smile and a warmth that just drew others in. She was just an overall amazing person. And friends and teachers remember Lindsay's genuine ability to make people feel valued. She, quote, could make friends with everybody, unquote. And that's what her father, Jeff, later said about her. Yet Lindsay wasn't just friendly. She had a compassionate streak and a strong sense of right and wrong. And her mother tells of an instance when Lindsay witnessed a boy being bullied at school, where Lindsay immediately stood up for him, stepping in to stop the teasing, saying, quote, I was really proud because that's the way you're supposed to be. And Evelyn would say that about her daughter's bravery. So Lindsay's nurturing, people-oriented personality came with a protective side. And she held firm anti-drug values and chose her inner circle very carefully. In fact, in one of her later relationships, one thing she proudly told her family was that he didn't do drugs, which was a key point for Lindsay, who stayed away from substance use and just frowned on that lifestyle overall. So just an extremely mature young lady. So she was a young woman who was both ambitious and compassionate in equal measure. And she had big dreams for her future, but never lost sight of kindness along the way. And she was not afraid of a little hard work either. Because having started employment so young, Lindsay developed a very strong work ethic really early on. So she balanced school with work and just proved to be very, very driven. And this would be a trait that would later serve her well when she decided to follow in her father's footsteps into real estate. So by her early 20s, Lindsay's ambitions crystallized into a career goal. She wanted to be a successful real estate agent in Victoria. So she would enroll in the University of British Columbia's Sauder School of Business Real Estate program. and studied hard to pass the licensing exam. And in June of 2006, at just the age of 22 years old, Lindsay achieved that goal. And she would pass her estate exam. And at the time, she was one of only 20 real estate agents in the entire Greater Victoria region under the age of 25. So it was clear that Lindsay was just a rising star in an industry typically dominated by older, more experienced agents. But she would hit the ground running. And Lindsay's first job in the field was with a small brokerage called Maverick, where she spent about a year and a half marketing new townhouses in Victoria's West Shore area. And being eager to advance, she next took an opportunity at Remax Camison. And being one of Victoria's top agencies, and notably the same office where Jason Zalo's family worked. And we'll talk about Jason's relevance to the story in a bit. So joining Remax brought Lindsay under the wing of the high-performing Zalo real estate clan, and Lindsay didn't miss a beat. And during about a year-long period, Lindsay managed to close 8 property transactions totaling about $3.2 million in value. So it was a strong start for a 24-year-old new agent. And colleagues commented that Lindsay seemed just destined for success in real estate because she was sharp and driven and personable. All things you need to be a great real estate agent. My dad's a real estate agent, so I would know. But to say the least, she was absolutely kicking ass in the industry. And she was just exactly the kind of agent clients trusted. And a former coworker later noted that Lindsay was determined to become successful in her career as a licensed real estate agent, and she worked tirelessly toward that goal. And in that short amount of time, she had built a very promising reputation in Victoria's property market. And it was around the same time her real estate career was taking off that Lindsay's love life took a significant turn. And in late 2005, while attending a real estate networking event and training workshop, 22-year-old Lindsay crossed paths with 25-year-old Jason Zalo. And now she already knew of Jason from around town because he came from a very prominent, wealthy local family deeply involved in real estate. And Jason's mother, Shirley, was a successful realtor also. And the family owned investment properties as well. So they were just kind of known in that industry. And Jason himself had been a competitive hockey player in his youth and now worked as a mortgage broker and realtor. So in Lindsay's eyes, the Zalo family were real estate royalty in Victoria, and she was impressed. Quote, she really looked up to the fact that Jason was in the real estate industry and his mom was too, unquote, said Lindsay's friend Vicky, saying that Lindsay seemed to be excited to be welcomed into the Zalo's world. And by mid-2006, Lindsay and Jason began dating seriously. And their relationship moved quickly, and soon they were living together. And the Zalos provided the couple with a one-bedroom condominium in Victoria's Inner Harbor area, which the family owned. And that area, I've been there a bunch of times, beautiful, absolutely beautiful area. And quite expensive. And they also spent summers at a lavish lakefront vacation home Shirley Zalo had purchased on Shawnigan Lake, where Lindsay and Jason enjoyed the amenities, and even had a private basement suite. So from the outside, Lindsay seemed to have it all. A supportive boyfriend from a well-off family, and a budding career. I know we all love researching or listening to all things true crime, but what I love more, and I'm sure you do too if you have them, your fur babies, your pets, your doggos. And I love my 5 dogs very much. Kevin, Debbie, Petey, Frankie, and Rupert. And I want them to be around as long to me. I don't recipes, guys. Better take advantage of it because it is awesome. And plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. So that's ollie.com/CCCM and enter code CCCM to get 60% off your first box. Thank you to Ollie for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. As 2007 drew a close, Lindsay confided to those closest to her that things with Jason were not as perfect as they appeared. And during a visit to see her father in Calgary on December 5th, 2007, Lindsay admitted she was unhappy in the relationship. And she told her dad that Jason didn't share the same drive or quote-unquote ambition she had, and that was causing friction. And it was during this time Lindsay even hinted at possibly ending the relationship. And she would repeat similar sentiments to her friends back home, telling them she wasn't fully satisfied with Jason and was considering breaking up.
She just said, Daddy, I made a mistake. I feel horrible about it. But she said, I can't do it anymore.
And Jason, when later asked, said he was aware that they had some troubles in the late 2007, but claimed they never discussed breaking up and that he believed the relationship wasn't in danger of ending. And interestingly, not everyone saw the cracks. Lindsay's sister Sarah thought the couple seemed happy together and noted that Jason, quote, treated her well, unquote, in her experience. And there's, I don't know, treating someone well, and then there's someone just not having any ambition or drive. You know, you're not an evil person if you're not driven, but, you know, if like personalities don't match, then it doesn't match. You can look a certain way on the outside or appear a certain way, but that doesn't mean that you're good. So I think it's just kind of an odd thing to say. So in early January 2008, Lindsay and Jason went on a trip to Whistler with Jason's family, a vacation Lindsay hoped would rekindle their closeness. And by all appearances, it appeared to work. And Lindsay came back from the Whistler getaway optimistic that she and Jason had turned a corner, saying, quote, we had such fun. This was the perfect thing. We needed to spend more time together, unquote. And she would tell this to her mother, just sounding overall upbeat about their future. So by all accounts, heading into February 2008, Lindsay was trying to make the best of their relationship. And she and Jason were still living together and, for the moment, putting on a united front. But unfortunately, Lindsay would never get the chance to decide what she truly wanted next, because her life was about to be cut short in a way as shocking as it was brutal. So late January 2008, Lindsay received a phone call that would change her life. An unfamiliar woman's voice spoke on the other end of Lindsay's cell phone, and the caller had a thick foreign accent, which Lindsay would later say she couldn't quite describe, maybe Spanish or Mexican, though she wasn't sure. Though something about it struck Lindsay as possibly fake. And the woman would introduce herself, though Lindsay would not recall the name and notably did not write it down, and got straight to the point. And she said her husband was being transferred to Victoria for work and they needed to buy a house immediately. And not just any house, a $1 million property, newly built, move-in ready, with a separate suite for a housekeeper. So extremely specific and extremely quick, and just all around extremely odd. So the timeline was urgent. The woman claimed they wanted to purchase within a few days, which is insane in the real estate world. I mean, my dad's a real estate, that's crazy. That is like next level crazy, even in this time. So this unsolicited inquiry was both exciting and obviously unsettling for Lindsay, because as a relatively new realtor with no seven-figure listings of her own, a potential $1 million sale was a huge opportunity, the kind that would kickstart her career and yield a hefty commission. But something about the call just didn't sit right, and Lindsay couldn't shake a sense of unease. Because for one, the client's supposed referral made no sense. And when Lindsay asked how she'd gotten her personal cell number, the woman vaguely replied that a friend of her husband's had recommended Lindsay. And after the call, Lindsay diligently checked with all her recent clients and contacts, but none had any idea who this mystery woman could be. So it appeared the referral story was a lie, which is a massive red flag, and there were other red flags. One being the accent. The woman was like deliberately disguising her voice with this fake accent, and the unusual urgency and specifics of the request as well. And Lindsay confided in her father and boyfriend about the strange call, and she told her dad outright that she had a weird feeling about these new clients. And Lindsay referred to the unknown couple as, quote-unquote, the Mexicans, referencing the accent, when discussing the situation with friends. So to keep track of the inquiry, Lindsay saved the caller's phone number in her contacts under the label, quote-unquote, $1 million. And it was just a defining feature of these clients, a $1 million budget. But the name also hints at Lindsay's skepticism. This potential deal seemed almost too good to be true, as she remarked to her boyfriend Jason. And Lindsay's instincts would be spot on, but she just didn't know it yet. So the clients insisted on meeting soon, and they set an appointment for the next evening, Saturday, February 2nd, 2008, at 5:30 p.m. to view properties. And with a mix of eagerness and dread, Lindsay agreed to show them a few homes. But she privately expressed that something about this just didn't feel right. And court documents later confirmed what Lindsay feared. because the people behind that phone were setting a trap. I want to take a break from today's video to thank today's sponsor, a brand that supports this channel, and that brand is Surfshark. Surfshark VPN to be exact. And honestly, I've been using it for months now, and it's become essential for how I create content for country libraries, including data when I needed help. Complete extra description and get the day selecting suitable homes in the upscale Gordon Head neighborhood of Saanich that fit the couple's criteria for a home, which was new construction, vacant, around $1 million. And one property was recent build on a small cul-de-sac, and that was 1702 De Sosa Place. And this house was listed at $964,000 and was brand new and unoccupied, a perfect candidate for a home. And it had been built by a developer named Joe D'Souza, a friend and business associate of none other than Shirley Zalo, Jason's mother. And Lindsay herself had never listed this property. Another agent in her office had it, but as a realtor, she could show any MLS listing and still earn commission. So the quiet street had only 4 houses on it, arranged around a short dead-end lane that intersected a main road. So the scene was set for very private viewing, which, as we'll see soon, was by design. But there was no busy traffic, and 2 of the 4 homes on the cul-de-sac were still under construction. In other words, few potential witnesses around. And that evening, Shirley Zalo decided to stop by the condo where Lindsay and Jason lived. And Shirley arrived around 7:15 p.m., supposedly just as a casual visit to see her son and his girlfriend. And as she entered the unit, Shirley happened to catch Lindsay in the middle of a phone conversation. And it was the mystery woman calling back to finalize the next day's plans. And for about 10 minutes or so, Shirley overheard bits of Lindsay's side of the discussion before Lindsay hung up. And Lindsay then revealed the details to Shirley, which was that the clients were confirmed for a 5:30 p.m. showing on Saturday at 1702 De Sousa Place. So everything was arranged. And Shirley later said that she immediately felt concerned. Sensing Lindsay's slight discomfort, Shirley repeatedly offered to go to the showing in Lindsay's place, essentially volunteering to meet the clients herself. And it's not clear if Shirley's worry was driven by Lindsay's safety or simply wanting to help her attend other plans. Because Lindsay had mentioned possibly heading to Vancouver for a friend's bachelorette party after the showing. But either way, she was trying to help. She was offering her help. But Lindsay declined the help, and she insisted she would handle it. After all, this was her client and her commission on the line. However, the fact that Shirley Zalo knew exactly when and where Lindsay was meeting the unknown clients, and even the content of their phone call, would later become one of many troubling footnotes in this case. And some would question whether it was mere coincidence that the house chosen for the showing was built by Shirley's acquaintance, or that Shirley happened to be present during the planning. But on February 1st, 2008, those connections were not yet the subject of suspicion, just hindsight. By nightfall, all was set. And at the condo, Jason returned home from a hockey game around midnight, and he and Lindsay talked about her nerves. And Jason at this point was just trying to reassure her, and even made the same offer as his mother did. And he suggested he go and meet the clients for her, or at least accompany her, so that Lindsay could leave early for her trip to the mainland after the showing. But Lindsay just shrugged it off. So she was feeling uneasy, but also just curious. Because why had she been chosen by this caller? Because she had so little experience at this point. It just wasn't adding up. And again, I mean, we look at this case with all the red flags there, but hindsight's 2020. I mean, you just don't know at this point. You don't assume that people are going to hurt you. So still, Lindsay told Jason she would do it and that he didn't need to interfere. And if she was concerned, she surely would accept help. At least that's what Jason thought. So when she declined his help, he assumed she felt confident enough to proceed. And they went to bed, perhaps both a little on edge, but hopeful that by the next evening, Lindsay might be closing the deal of her life. So February 2nd, 2008 began normally for Lindsay Buziak, albeit with jitters. That morning, the mysterious client actually called the landline at the condo and reached Jason, because Lindsay was out at the time. And Jason told the caller Lindsay wasn't home and offered to give her Lindsay's cell phone number. But the woman coolly said she already had it. And Jason noted that the caller's accent sounded like, quote-unquote broken Spanish, just confirming the same voice Lindsay had heard on the phone as well. And this brief exchange was the last contact before the ill-fated meeting. So as afternoon approached, Lindsay grew increasingly anxious. And around 2 p.m., she went into her RE/MAX Camison office on Chatterton Way. And there she pulled aside 2 receptionists and asked them to search the names and the phone numbers of these clients, because they had given her numbers and names, and they should be in the real estate database if they had bought anything in Victoria specifically. So Lindsay just basically wanted to see if these people had any history of buying or selling in Victoria, just to know that these people exist or have done business here. But nothing came up. It was as if they didn't exist. So Lindsay was visibly uneasy at this point, quote unquote freaked out, according to the colleague who overheard her talking about the situation. And sensing her discomfort, a few coworkers, including one named Cal, offered to accompany her to the 5:30 showing. But Lindsay, again, declined the offer, reassuring them that it was okay because her boyfriend Jason would be there for backup. Quote, she had full confidence her boyfriend was going to be there, unquote, Cal would recall. So Lindsay may have been spooked, but she had a safety plan, and that was that Jason would meet her right after the clients arrived, just to be sure everything was fine, so at least there's that. So at around 3 p.m., Lindsay left the office and met up with Jason for a late lunch downtown. And they chose a restaurant by the Inner Harbor and finished around 4:24 p.m. And that was the time that was actually stamped on their paid bill later. And over lunch, Lindsay was distracted. She ate quickly and went over the property feature sheets she had prepared, showing Jason the list of homes she planned to take the couple to, including 1702 DeSouza Place. And Jason, just sensing her nerves, once again offered to do the showing for her. But again, Lindsay said no, perhaps trying to prove to herself she could handle such a big client despite the odd circumstances. And by 5 p.m., with dusk falling on a cloudy winter evening, the couple split up to get ready for their respective plans. And Lindsay headed back to their condo to change clothes, wanting to look professional for her high-end clients. And Jason, meanwhile, drove to a nearby auto detailing shop called SHC Auto Graphics to briefly meet a colleague and pick up a friend, Cohen Oatman. And Cohen was both a friend and an employee of Jason's, and they played on the same men's recreational hockey team. And the two had gone to a hockey game scheduled for later that night, after Lindsay's showing. And they intended to go together once Jason checked on Lindsay. So while Jason was in the meeting at the auto shop, his friend Cohen began calling his phone repeatedly, eager to link up. And by about 5:30 p.m., Cohen arrived at the shop and hopped into Jason's Range Rover. And Jason explained to Cohen that he had gotten a call from Lindsay earlier asking him to meet her at the house because she was uneasy about the situation. And according to what Lindsay had texted Jason, she provided the address 1702 DeSouza Place and essentially asked him to quote-unquote follow her there. So Jason would tell Cohen that a quick detour was needed, and they would swing by the house just to check that Lindsay was okay, and then head out to their hockey game after. So Cohen would agree without hesitation. And at roughly 5:35 p.m., Lindsay pulled up to the cul-de-sac on DeSouza Place. And the street, as we know, was newly built and so recent that it didn't even appear on Jason's SUV GPS map. So as Lindsay parked and stepped out, her phone rang and it was Jason, and he was lost in the maze of Gordon Head's residential streets calling for directions. So Lindsay began to guide him over the phone. But before she could finish, she saw something that made her cut the call short, saying, quote, "Oh, I've got to go. They're here," unquote, she told Jason abruptly, because the new clients had arrived. And Lindsay would hang up with Jason still on the line and would turn to greet a couple approaching the driveway. And multiple witnesses later provided remarkably consistent descriptions of the pair Lindsay met at approximately 5:30 p.m. So the couple appeared to have come on foot, walking up to the cul-de-sac, not driving, which is very odd. And the witnesses watched as Lindsay, ever professional, stepped forward with a warm smile and shook hands with the couple at the front steps. And Lindsay did not seem to recognize them personally, and her greeting was courteous but obviously formal. And the neighbors later remarked it looked like the first meeting between agent and clients, nothing indicating that they were friends at all. And that's when Lindsay would lead the man and woman through the front door of the house and close the door behind them. And unbeknownst to Lindsay, she had just sealed herself inside an empty home with a pair of killers. So inside 1702 D'Souza Place, the air must have been chilly because the home was vacant and the early February evening was beginning to become dark. And Lindsay's cell phone records show that at 5:29 p.m., just before the couple arrived, she accessed the lockbox to retrieve the house key. And the lockbox timestamp was later noted by investigators. So now, at around 5:30 something, she began the routine of showing the property. And we can only really imagine her initial nervousness gave way to her professional training. And she likely pointed out features of the entryway and main floor, trying to build rapport with the clients. And on the surface, nothing appeared amiss during those first few minutes. And outside, Jason and Cohen were just minutes away. Having just gotten off the phone with Lindsay abruptly, Jason still didn't have the precise directions. And he would actually call his younger brother for navigational help. And he would start driving to the neighborhood with that help. Meanwhile, Lindsay did manage to send Jason a quick text with step-by-step directions to find D'Souza Place. And this would be the last message she would ever send. So at about 5:38 p.m., Jason texted back to say, quote, "I'm a couple minutes away," unquote, letting Lindsay know he'd be there shortly. But that text would never be opened. And shortly thereafter, the quote-unquote showing moved upstairs. And the home's main bedroom was on the second floor at the top of the staircase. And perhaps Lindsay led the couple up, chatting about the layout, and walked ahead of them into the master bedroom to show off its ensuite bathroom. But it was at that moment, around 5:40 to 5:41 p.m., that the trap was sprung. And as Lindsay turned her back, one of the pair attacked her swiftly from behind. And it was at that point that Lindsay would be stabbed with a knife or knives, just in a frenzy. And Lindsay would have virtually no time to react or defend herself. But the attack would be vicious and personal. The whole scene was just the definition of overkill. And early news reports would sensationalize that Lindsay was stabbed, quote, more than 40 times, unquote, but police have since debunked that exact number as an exaggeration. But she did suffer multiple wounds concentrated in her chest and abdomen, along with numerous cuts and nicks. But it just indicated a very frenzied assault. And it all happened extremely fast because she had no defensive wounds at all on her arms or hands, which is it's not normal in these sort of circumstances unless it's completely just out of nowhere. It just implies she had absolutely no chance to fight back or even raise her hands to protect herself. And it means that the first stabs likely just incapacitated her almost immediately. And in the midst of this attack, an eerie and crucial event occurred, and Lindsay's phone, still in her jacket pocket, accidentally dialed a number. And at 5:41 p.m., as Lindsay was being attacked, her BlackBerry made an outbound call, a pocket dial, to a friend she wasn't in frequent contact with. And the friend received a muffled voicemail that captured distant noises from inside the house, and the sounds of movement, and perhaps one of Lindsay's last words or gasps or a distant thud. The message itself was unintelligible, but clearly not a normal call. And later, Saanich Detective Sergeant Chris Horsley would confirm this pocket-dialed voicemail as likely occurring, quote-unquote, at the point of attack. The whole thing is incredibly horrible and sad, but I mean, to have just like a recording of it is, I can't even imagine what that would be like for, I just think about the families at this point, and it's just like, I just can't imagine. But basically, it was an inadvertent cry for help that went unheard in time. And at around 5:45 p.m., Lindsay was almost deceased, and she would be laying in the master bedroom of that home. So the unknown man and woman had executed their sick, disgusting plan. But at that same moment, headlights swept into D'Souza Place, and Jason and Cohen arrived at the address, later than expected, but finally there. And as they pulled up in front of 1702, Jason saw something odd through the decorative glass of the front door, and he glimpsed a shadowy figure moving in the entrance foyer, and then a person quickly receding from view deeper into the house as the Range Rover's headlights illuminated the front window. So it looked like someone was peeking out and then retreated. And Jason assumed this was just part of the showing, that maybe Lindsay and the clients were walking around inside, and just not wanting to interrupt or seem like an overly nosy boyfriend, he decided not to barge in. And Lindsay had allegedly asked for him not to interfere with the showing by making his presence known. And instead, Jason chose to park down the street for a few minutes to give the showing a little bit more time. And he told Cohen that it looked like the appointment was still going on, so they should just wait. So Jason would drive a short distance away, then circle back a couple of minutes later. And by now, it was close to 5:55 to 6 p.m., and he parked in front of the house again. But no sign of anyone was through the windows now. And that's when Jason sent a text to Lindsay's phone saying, "Are you okay?" But there was no response. And he tried then calling her cell, but then there was no answer. And now Jason started to worry. But he naturally assumed maybe they were just talking inside, maybe she was still doing the showing, and maybe it was just going really well and that they had more questions. But obviously, as we know, that wasn't the case. And 10 more minutes passed in silence, and the house from the outside looked dark and very still. And at around 6:05 p.m., approximately 20 minutes after the first arrival, Jason's concern reached a tipping point, because Lindsay still had not replied or emerged, and Jason decided to take action. So pulling up the driveway with Cohen, he got out and went straight to the front door of 1702 De Sousa. And to his alarm, it was locked. So he repeatedly knocked and rang the doorbell, but it yielded no answers. So Jason would peer through the frosted glass insert and saw a very disturbing sight, and that was Lindsay's shoes that were laying in the entryway inside. So she clearly had taken them off upon entering, which meant she was likely still inside. But why wasn't she coming to the door? Was she hurt? Did something happen? So with a surge of panic, Jason pulled out his phone and dialed 911. So it was now 6:05 p.m. when he told the emergency operator that he was at a house where his girlfriend was showing a home and he couldn't get in, and he was worried that something may have happened to her. And he emphasized that he had come to check on her because she had, quote, been kind of scared about this showing. And as he was on the phone, Cohen was searching the perimeter of the house for another way in. And he found a gate to the backyard, but it was secured. But Cohen managed to spot something important, because through the fence slats, he could see that the back patio's French doors were wide open. So he waved to Jason and pointed urgently. And the killers, it turns out, had fled through those back doors moments earlier, escaping into the night. And in their haste, they left the doors gaping open behind them, and likely slipped through a gap in the backyard fence out to that main road. So seeing that open door, Jason hung up with 911 mid-call after providing the address and sprang into action. And he ran to boost Cohen over the backyard fence, and Cohen dropped into the yard and dashed through the open French doors into the house. And he immediately unlocked the front door from the inside, allowing Jason to rush in behind him. And the two men split up in the foyer, and Cohen took the main floor and Jason took the second. And as Jason was running up the staircase, he was yelling, "Lindsay, Lindsay," into the silence. And as he neared the top of the stairs, a nightmare materialized. And he could see Lindsay's body slumped onto the floor in the master bedroom. And he also saw blood. And Lindsay would be found lying on her back, collapsed against the wall. And Jason just dropped to his knees at her side, frantically trying to rouse her. And Cohen, horrified, immediately called 911 again at 6:11 p.m., urgently telling the dispatcher that they needed an ambulance right away. And Jason, in a state of shock, began attempting CPR on Lindsay, even though it was far too late. So he tilted her head and started mouth-to-mouth breaths, and in a chilling, incredibly chilling detail. And within minutes, the sirens of the first responders pierced the quiet neighborhood, and paramedics arrived and police cars swarmed the cul-de-sac. But despite resuscitation attempts by EMTs, Lindsay Buziak was pronounced dead at the scene. And Jason was just in hysterics and, I imagine, complete disbelief. And he kept trying to will time backwards, saying, quote, "If I was 10 minutes earlier, if I went with her. Would she still be alive? I just can't even imagine. I can't even imagine the thought process after witnessing that. I feel so incredibly horrible for him. But no one had seen this mysterious couple leave. They were like ghosts who vanished before anyone realized what had happened. And the only physical evidence left behind were a bloody footprints inside the house and a trail on the stairs indicating the path the killers took as they calmly walked out of the front entry, only to retreat and escape out the back when Jason's arrival spooked them. So it appeared the murderers were literally in the process of walking out the door when Jason and Cohen pulled up, forcing them to flee via Plan B over the back fence. So if Jason had arrived just a minute or two earlier, he may have come face to face with them. Not that that would have changed Lindsay's fate, but maybe we would know who they are now. But I think thinking what ifs in this situation is just not helpful at all in any sense, because you can't change the past. So in a matter of minutes, a bright, beloved young woman's life had been brutally snuffed out. And the reverberations of this carefully planned homicide were only just beginning to be felt. And as the crime scene tape went up around 1702 D'Souza Place on that cold February night, the investigation into Lindsay Buziak's murder was launched. And this was an investigation that would grow into one of the most perplexing and high-profile unsolved cases in Canadian crime history. So Saanich police quickly secured the D'Souza Place property as a crime scene, but from the outset, investigators faced a major challenge. And that was that the scene had been compromised by the frantic rescue effort. And in their desperation to find and help Lindsay, Jason and Cohen had necessarily trampled through the house, inadvertently contaminating evidence, which, I mean, you can't blame them. I mean, they were trying to look for her and then trying to help save her. Like, I just feel so bad. But within hours, the Saanich Police Department's major crime unit took charge of the case. And they realized they were dealing with anything but an ordinary murder. And forensic examiners scored the empty house late into the night and the following days. But they would find no usable DNA or fingerprints from the perpetrators. And they assumed that the assailants had likely worn gloves and perhaps protective clothing or shoe covers that they took with them. So this was clearly an extremely calculated murder. And the murder weapon, presumed to be a sharp-edged knife, was not found at the scene either. And the only clue was the bloody shoe prints tracked along the floor. But even these were limited, and the specific shoe brand or size was not released publicly, suggesting it might not have even been distinctive enough to trace conclusively. And the absence of defensive wounds on Lindsay and the sheer ferocity of the told investigators that this was a targeted execution, not a robbery gone wrong. And how would it even be a robbery? This was a vacant home. So the only conclusion could be that this was a calculated attack, a murder in the first degree. And outside the house, potential witness information was minimal, because neighbors only saw the well-dressed couple arriving, not leaving. And no one recalled hearing screams or loud noises, implying Lindsay may have been attacked so suddenly that she couldn't even cry out for help. And that's assuming people were in close enough proximity to hear screams anyway. But investigators were intrigued by the victim's last known communications, because the pocket dial voicemail Lindsay's phone made during the attack was recovered, but yielded little beyond muffled background noise. And the final text message from Jason to Lindsay was, "Are you okay?" and it remained unread on her phone. And police also quickly traced the cell phone that had lured Lindsay, and it was, as suspected, a burner phone registered under a bogus name, which was Paulo Rodriguez, and a fake business address in Vancouver. And records showed it had been purchased 3 months earlier in Vancouver and activated just the day before the murder. And it made calls exclusively to Lindsay and was powered off permanently soon after she was killed. So authorities believed that the phone was used only for planning and executing this crime, then disposed of. Just a hallmark of organized, premeditated murder. And it even pinged off a cell phone tower near the murder house the night before, suggesting the suspects did a dry run or surveillance of the area in advance. It's just sickening, horrifying, chilling, sickening. It's all just a nightmare to think about. So the forensic and physical evidence thus painted a grim picture. And that is that this homicide was carefully organized and executed by individuals who knew exactly what they were doing, likely had done it many times before, because the degree of planning just indicated an experienced hand. using an untraceable phone, choosing an empty house, a new build, and minimizing forensic traces. Yet, paradoxically, the overkill violence was very emotional and amateurish in its frenzy. So you have this very calculated, planned murder, and then the murder itself felt like a rabid attack of emotion. Like it wasn't thought of, it just happened out of nowhere. It just didn't fit the profile of a dispassionate professional hit. So this contradiction just puzzled police, because the murder had both highly professional elements and intensely personal ferocity. So within the first day, police had to consider a difficult reality. The two suspects seen by witnesses had essentially vanished into thin air at this point, and they left virtually no trace of their identities inside the house, and no one saw a getaway vehicle. So the only thing known was how they looked, and that one had possibly a fake accent. So the composite sketch of the female suspect was developed from witness descriptions and released to the public a year later in 2009. And it depicted a Caucasian woman in her mid-30s with short, stylish blonde hair and a calm expression. And alongside, police described the male suspect as Caucasian, about 6 foot, with dark hair wearing a brown jacket. And the woman's dress was also highlighted, a black, white, and red patterned dress that was very distinctive. And for investigators, it was as if the suspects had worn a mask and then disappeared into a crowd, though. And they had to start considering who could have orchestrated such a plot and why Lindsay was the target. So the Saanich police threw themselves fully into the hunt for Lindsay's killers. And the department was not large, and a murder of this complexity was a major undertaking. And at least 5 full-time investigators were assigned to the case. And they conducted exhaustive interviews with everyone in Lindsay's life, including family, friends, colleagues, past clients, ex-boyfriends, rivals, anyone who might shed light. And within the first year after the murder, police had conducted nearly 1,500 interviews and received 752 tips and executed 30 search warrants. So this was an enormous volume of investigative work, reflecting just how many angles they were exploring for this case. And the major crime unit led by Inspector Rob McCall coordinated the efforts, and Detective Sergeant Chris Horsley became the public face of the case, often appealing for information and addressing rumors. And early on, the SPD acknowledged they were dealing with an exceptionally challenging case. And in a rare statement, a spokesperson called it a crime of quote-unquote extraordinary complexity, involving individuals who were experienced and quote-unquote had no regard for human life. And leads were pursued not just in Victoria, but across provincial lines, recognizing the possible wider connections, such as ties to Calgary or Vancouver criminal groups. And Saanich police welcomed help from outside agencies as well. And the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were brought in to provide oversight and specialized resources. And the case was also significant enough that the FBI agents from the United States were later consulted, particularly when it came to the new technology and behavioral analysis. And over the years, the investigation grew to staggering proportions. And by 2020, Saanich police said they had over 2,000 persons of interest or entities logged in the case file. And they had obtained in excess of 35 court warrants and production orders targeting cell phone companies, internet providers, and even social media like Facebook to pull data relevant to the crime. But the sheer volume of information was immense, requiring meticulous organization and analysis. But detectives were determined to not let a single clue slip through the cracks, and they would also examine cell tower pings. And advanced techniques like DNA analysis were repeatedly applied to what few samples they had, though initially none yielded a suspect profile. And the house had been professionally cleaned just before the showing, as it was a newly staged house, so there was little trace of evidence in the environment to start with. So from day one, investigators and armchair detectives alike grappled with the burning question: who ordered the murder of Lindsay Buziak, and why? And over the years, several theories emerged, some pursued by police, others fueled by internet speculation. But we'll explore the main ones here, noting what evidence, if any, supports them and how authorities have responded. So first, we have Jason, Lindsay's boyfriend. Naturally, he would be the first suspect, and the first person that police would scrutinize. Because in most homicide investigations, you start with the inner circle or those closest to the victim. And Jason was right at the center. He was the one who found her body, and that often raises suspicion, obviously. So could Jason have been involved in setting up Lindsay? And motive-wise, the relationship had known troubles, as we know. Lindsay had considered leaving him, and there were rumors of jealousy as well. Some who distrusted Jason speculated he might have arranged to eliminate Lindsay if he couldn't bear to let her go. And it didn't help Jason's case in the public eye that his family was wealthy and influential, because people love to suspect the rich boyfriend in a true crime story. However, police have repeatedly stated that Jason Zalo is not a suspect. And that's because Jason's actions and alibi on the day the murder largely, completely check out. Because after lunch, he was indeed seen on surveillance video at the auto shop at around 5:30 p.m., leaving with Cohen in his Range Rover. And the timing on the CCTV proves he was not at the murder scene when Lindsay was killed, because she was likely being killed at 5:40 to 5:41 p.m., and it would have been difficult to make it there and pull it off in that time. And by difficult,